Years passed on Earth, and the work continued without interruption. The humans moved in long lines toward the mines each morning. They carried tools made of metal and stone. They entered the deep shafts of the Abzu and dug into the ground for gold. From above, the work looked like a system that never stopped. Ore was pulled from the earth. Then, the gold was melted, cleaned, and placed into transport vessels that rose toward the sky. At first, everything worked exactly as it had been designed. From the command platform above the mining zone, Enlil studied the flowing numbers across the projection screens. Shipments moved on schedule. The reserves on Nibiru slowly increased. But below the platform, the human camps slowly began to change. What had once been small clusters of rough shelters began to spread across the land. At first, the shelters were simple. Humans stacked branches and covered them with mud and leaves. The wind passed through the walls, but the shelters gave them rest after long hours in the mines. Season after season, those shelters became stronger. The people learned to cut wood into straight beams. They pressed clay into bricks and let the sun harden them. The walls built in this way were much stronger. Similarly, they built their roofs, and now they were protected from both rain and wind. Over time, people began building their shelters closer together. They connected them with paths, and in the very center, they lit a large fire every night. Children ran through the open areas, while the older workers prepared tools for the next day. And just like this, small camps slowly became villages. At the same time, people began speaking to each other more clearly than before. In the earliest days, their voices had been simple sounds used for warning or command. Their language was not complex. It consisted of the simplest words, along with gestures and body movement. But they understood one another. They could solve problems at work together. One man pointed to a broken beam and spoke to another. The second man answered and showed him a better way to lift the weight. And as time passed, it seemed that communication between them was becoming more complex. Of course, Enlil noticed these changes from the command center. On the large viewing screens, he saw the growing villages and the groups of people working together without direct orders. Enlil crossed his arms and said with quiet concern, "They speak more freely each cycle." At first, this did not trouble him. Even he could see the benefits in it. Enlil often thought to himself that their coordination improves the work. But deep inside, he knew it would not stop there. Years continued to pass. The humans began shaping symbols into wet clay. At first, the marks were simple. One line meant grain, another shape meant water. A man pressed a symbol into a clay tablet and carried it to another village. When the second village saw the symbol, they understood the message. Ideas began to travel farther than voices could reach. One evening, Enlil walked through a settlement and stopped before a wall covered in carved symbols. He studied the marks carefully. Nearby, a group of children sat beside an older man who showed them how to draw the same symbols in soft clay. The children copied the shapes again and again. Enlil watched the lesson and said with quiet unease, "They teach each other without command." After written symbols came music. When the humans had first been created, the only sound that could be heard was the dull strike of tools hitting the stone they mined. Now the sound had changed. In the evenings, after the work was done, people gathered around the fire. They sat close together and began to clap their hands in a steady rhythm. Some of the people learned that dry reeds made a clear sound when air was blown through them. They cut small holes into the hollow reeds and blew gently, creating simple flute-like tones that carried across the camp. Others discovered rhythm differently. They struck 2 wooden sticks against flat stones, creating a sharp, steady beat. The sound echoed through the night, while others clapped along. What had once been the noise of labor slowly became the sound of music. Suddenly, all these changes began to trouble Enlil in a way he had not expected. He noticed that many women were no longer going to the mines to dig for gold. Instead, they spent most of their days near the homes, caring for the children. After gathering fruit and plants from the nearby land, they would often sit together outside their shelters. With quiet patience, they used small pieces of wood, smooth stones, and dried seeds to make simple necklaces and small decorations. They drilled tiny holes into the pieces and tied them together with thin plant fibers. Soon, many people in the villages began wearing these simple ornaments around their necks and wrists. To Enlil, these small changes meant something larger. Time that had once been used only for labor was now being spent on things that had nothing to do with the mines. What he saw was order forming in a way he had not planned. And for the first time since the creation of the human workers, Enlil felt something he had not expected. He remembered the early days when humans had barely understood speech. They had followed simple commands and nothing more. Now everything was different. Enlil watched the villages growing across the land, and a troubling thought began to form in his mind. He wondered if the progress of the humans might one day bring danger to Nibiru again. The very reason they had been created was to protect their home world. Their rapid growth frightened him in a way he had never expected. It troubled him even more than the time when the Igigi had refused to work in the mines. And Enlil began to wonder whether the system he had created was beginning to change into something he could no longer control. After many hours of thought, Enlil made a decision. He would speak with Enki. He wanted to share what he had observed and hear what his brother had to say. Later that day, Enlil summoned Enki to the central chamber. Enlil stood beside the projection with his hands behind his back. His expression was firm, but inside he carried a deep concern. When Enki entered the chamber, Enlil studied his brother carefully. Enlil had expected resistance, but what disappointed him most was how calm Enki looked. It did not take long for Enlil to realize something troubling. Enki had seen everything he had seen: the villages, the music, and the growing independence among the humans. But Enki did not see it as a problem. Enlil stepped closer to the projection table and began the conversation with controlled tension, saying, "You have seen the settlements. Their numbers increase every cycle." Enki looked at the glowing map for a moment before answering. Instead of concern, there was clear fascination in his eyes. He studied the expanding villages and replied with calm interest, "Yes, and I have also seen what they are building." That answer only deepened Enlil's frustration. Enlil turned sharply toward him and said with restrained irritation, "Their task was simple. They mine gold so Nibiru survives." Enki walked slowly around the projection table, observing the lights that marked the human settlements. He rested his hand near one of the new villages on the display and said, "They have done far more than survive. They have learned to build and to adapt to the land. Enlil's posture stiffened as he replied with growing tension. You speak of their growth as if it were a victory. Enki looked at him calmly and answered, It is growth. It happened naturally. We did not command it. Enlil's patience was beginning to fade. He pointed toward the spreading settlements and said with sharp clarity, That is exactly the problem. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Enlil then moved closer to the projection and studied the growing clusters of light across the planet. His voice lowered, but his words carried firm authority. Enlil spoke slowly and said, Their numbers grow too quickly. When many people live close together, they exchange ideas. When ideas spread, knowledge grows. When knowledge grows, obedience weakens. Enki did not interrupt him. Enlil turned to face him again and spoke with firm conviction, saying, If their numbers remain this high, their development will continue to accelerate. He paused for a moment before finishing his thought. Then, Enlil lifted his head slightly and declared, We must reduce their number. The words hung heavily in the chamber. Enki studied his brother's face before he answered calmly, You would slow their progress by destroying them. Enlil did not hesitate and nodded once. Enki's expression hardened slightly, but he kept his voice steady. Then he asked quietly, Even if the mines slow down? Enlil answered immediately, saying, Yes, even if production falls for a time. His eyes remained fixed on the display as he finished his thought. That is how order returns. Enki studied him for several long seconds. Then he shook his head slightly. He spoke with quiet disappointment when he said, You see danger where I see possibility. Enlil's patience was gone now. Enlil turned toward him and said with rising anger, Possibility does not keep Nibiru alive. Silence filled the chamber as both brothers held their ground. Between Enlil and Enki, the distance widened. One guarded order and strict control. The other watched with deep interest. Enlil's voice grew colder as he said, The line between Anunnaki and human must stay firm. When that line blurs, command weakens. Enki looked at him steadily. He was disappointed that his brother could not see the beauty in human progress, but he simply said, They deserve space to grow. We created them to dig for gold, and they are doing that. Nibiru has never been more stable. Does it not interest you how far they can go? However, the very thought of that terrified Enlil. He did not even want to answer his brother's question, and instead he shouted angrily, We reduce their number. And Enki, this is not a compromise. This is an order. I do not need to remind you that our father placed me in charge of this planet and this project. The words echoed through the chamber. Enki knew that Enlil was right when he said he was in charge. He was the first heir of Anu, and most likely the next king of Nibiru. Enki was glad that his brother was a strong future king who thought about the generations on Nibiru. On the other hand, Enki had grown attached to his creation, and even though he did not want to admit it, he felt responsible for them. And whenever he said, I protect the people who work for us, I see what they can become, the fire cracked loudly between them. When he heard these words, Enlil took a slow step back. His anger had not faded, it just hardened into something else. He realized that his brother did not understand the seriousness of the situation in the same way. No further conversation would change anything now, because the two of them had begun to pursue different goals. The same problem that had brought them together many decades earlier was now driving them apart. As he walked away, the only thing Enlil said, without even looking at Enki, was, "Then I will restore order myself." Enki said nothing. He understood exactly what those words meant. What Enki did not know was how quickly Enlil had already made his decision. In Enlil's mind, the time for discussion had ended the moment he left the chamber. He believed that every day of delay allowed humans to grow stronger and more connected to one another, and the more they shared ideas, the faster they would advance. Enlil had no intention of waiting for that to happen. Immediately after leaving the chamber that day, he walked straight to the command center. There, without hesitation, he began preparing the first step of his plan. He chose to strike at the heart of the problem. If the number of humans kept rising, then the number had to fall. He stood inside the command chamber and activated a long-range signal toward Nibiru. His voice carried firm authority as he said, "Summon Namtar. He understands disease. He will carry out my command." Namtar was known among the Anunnaki as the one who controlled plagues and sickness. He served under higher command and moved where he was ordered. When the message reached Nibiru, preparations began at once. Within days, a transport craft descended through the sky and landed near the main base. Namtar stepped out, calm and silent. His presence felt heavy. He did not ask questions. He just waited for instructions. Enlil met him at the entrance of the command center, his posture straight and firm, and he said, "The population expands beyond control. You will spread disease among them. It must spread quickly." Namtar lowered his head and just replied, "It will be done." The plan moved without delay. Supplies were prepared and contact points were marked across the settlements. Soon after, the first signs appeared. One worker stumbled inside the mine. Another fell ill near the river. Fever spread through families, and even the strong lost their strength in days. Villages that once rang with music are now filled with coughing and cries. People gathered around the sick, unsure how to help. Children who once ran through the streets lay still inside their homes. The illness moved fast. It passed from one person to another with little warning. Fires that once burned for songs now burned for warmth around the dying. From the command platform, Enlil watched the reports come in. The numbers began to decrease, but it was still not enough. Some might think that Enlil was cruel, but he did not see it that way. All he wanted was for order to be restored. Enki noticed the change at once. He walked through one of the villages and saw bodies wrapped in cloth. He saw mothers holding children with burning skin. Even though he said nothing, he understood what had happened. He remembered Enlil's warning, and he knew this was his doing because before this, humans had never been sick. Every urge he felt to intervene, he pushed down when he quietly said to himself, "Enlil holds authority here." Enki convinced himself that he had no choice, even though he felt sadness as he watched his creation suffer and fade. Days turned into weeks. The disease began to spread to other villages. Enki withdrew into the laboratories until one day something happened. Among the people lived a man named Atrahasis. Among the people, Atrahasis was what Enki was among the Anunnaki. He was more curious than the others. He asked questions that others did not think to ask. He watched everything around him. Even though he did not have the knowledge of the Anunnaki, he was smart enough to think deeply and search for answers on his own. What Atrahasis noticed most was the way Enki looked at them. He saw it clearly. Enki watched the people with interest and respect. No other ruler who commanded them had ever looked at them that way. When the sickness spread, Atrahasis moved from house to house. He saw the same fever and the same sudden death. He did not know what caused it, but he was very afraid. He looked toward the high structures of the Anunnaki base and felt a heavy thought settle in his mind. Atrahasis gathered what strength he had and walked toward the outer fields near the command center. He passed guards who barely noticed him in his simple clothes. At the edge of the base, he found Enki standing alone, watching the distant villages. Atrahasis stepped forward, his voice strained but steady, and he said, "My lord, people are dying, but it is different. They do not die from age. They die because their bodies burn with heat. You must help us." Enki looked at Atrahasis for a long moment before answering. The man stood in front of him with fear in his eyes, yet he did not step back. Enki finally spoke, his voice calm but heavy, and he said, "What spreads among your people is a sickness." Atrahasis frowned slightly and asked, "What is sickness?" Enki paused, choosing his words carefully, and he replied, "It is a condition that enters the body and weakens it. It brings heat, pain, and loss of strength. It moves from one person to another." Atrahasis listened closely, trying to understand, and then he asked with confusion in his voice, "But how does it begin all at once? We have never seen this before." At that question, Enki fell silent. He knew the answer, and he knew who had sent it. He even knew why it had begun so suddenly. Yet he kept those thoughts to himself. He turned his gaze away for a moment. He felt the weight of what he knew. Inside, Enki struggled with his thoughts. He felt a strong pull toward the people. He had watched them grow, learn, and create. He felt connected to them in a way he never expected. He knew Enlil had authority, yet he also felt responsibility. Finally, Enki lowered his voice and said firmly, "I will help you, but this must remain between us." Atrahasis nodded at once. Enki stepped closer and began to speak in clear, simple terms. He said, "Gather the people together. Separate those who are ill from those who are strong." Atrahasis listened with full attention. Enki continued, "Burn the clothing and bedding of those who carry the sickness. Fire destroys what spreads it." He raised his hand slightly and added, "Keep the sick apart. Do not let them move among the healthy." Atrahasis repeated the words in his mind. Enki then said, "Use smoke. Burn strong herbs, and let the smoke fill the houses. Smoke cleans the air." He looked directly at Atrahasis and said with serious warning, "You must not speak my name. Tell them this comes from your own wisdom. If Enlil learns that I guided you, his anger will grow." Atrahasis bowed his head and replied with firm resolve, "I understand." And without wasting time, Atrahasis returned to the village. He gathered the elders and spoke clearly. He told them to move the sick to separate shelters. He ordered clothing to be burned. He instructed families to keep a distance. He told them to fill their homes with smoke from strong plants. At first, the people hesitated, yet they had no better answer, so they followed his guidance. Fires burned across the settlement as infected items were thrown into flames. Separate huts were built for the sick. Guards stood at the edges of isolation areas to prevent movement. Days passed. The fever still burned in many bodies, but slowly, the number of deaths began to slow. Weeks later, the sickness started to fade. More people stood on their feet again. Children walked outside without fear. From the command platform, Enlil watched the numbers once more, and he noticed the change. He saw that many villages had begun to recover and that the number of deaths was decreasing. People stopped living in constant fear. Enlil knew something was wrong, and he said quietly to himself, "They could not have discovered this alone." The solution had come too quickly. The humans had advanced, but not enough to understand how to stop a disease they had never faced before. His jaw tightened as anger rose inside him. He knew Enki had interfered. The first plan had failed to bring the full result he wanted. Then he spoke with cold determination. If one measure fails, another follows. And in that moment, Enlil began shaping a new plan. He did not wait long. After the sickness failed to bring the balance he wanted, he chose a different path. This time he would strike at the land itself. If the people could survive disease, they would struggle against hunger. Inside the command chamber, Enlil activated a secure channel toward Nibiru once again. His voice carried calm authority as he said, "Send Adad." Adad was known among the Anunnaki as the one who studied the skies. On Nibiru, he observed cloud movement, wind currents, and air pressure. He measured how moisture gathered in the upper atmosphere and how rain returned to the ground. From tall observation towers, he tracked storms forming far away and calculated when and where rainfall would fall. He understood how much water the land needed to keep crops alive and how long fields could endure dry periods. A few days later, Adad stepped onto the soil of planet Earth. He already understood his task before anyone spoke it aloud. The dry wind moved across the landing site as he looked up at the wide sky, studying the clouds with sharp focus. Enlil met him at the entrance of the command center, his posture straight and his voice firm as he said, "I need you to alter the atmosphere of this planet so that the rains do not come." Adad listened without question. He understood what was being asked. Soon after, the clouds above the villages began to thin. The heavy air of the rainy season lifted. Days passed without a single drop of water. At first, the people did not understand what it meant. They simply noticed one morning that the fruits they gathered from the trees had begun to dry. Apples fell from the branches and rotted on the ground. Leaves lost their color. The plants that once grew wild near their homes turned brittle. As the days passed, the damage spread. But that was only the beginning. Soon, the rivers began to shrink. The wide streams that once carried clear water turned into shallow paths of mud. The little water that remained mixed with sand as strong winds swept across the land. People scooped it into their hands, yet it tasted bitter and dry. They searched for fresh water and found only dust. Once again, bodies grew weak, and this time, people began to die from starvation. In the mines, fewer workers arrived each day. Many were too weak from hunger to lift tools. Children cried at night from thirst. Mothers searched for water in places that once held steady streams. From the high platform, Enlil watched the land change color. The green faded into brown. He stood with his hands behind his back and said with quiet certainty, "Without rain, dependence returns." Adad remained near the upper atmosphere, guiding the clouds away from the land. Thunder formed over distant mountains, but never crossed into the valleys where the humans lived. The sun burned longer each day. Enki noticed the change almost at once. He looked toward the horizon and understood what had happened. He knew this was Enlil's command, and he knew which one from Nibiru was able to carry it out. This time, he promised himself he would remain on the side, because he knew his brother well. He was certain that Enlil would always go one step further to restore what he called perfect order and law. After several days of watching the land change, Atrahasis made a decision to go to Enki once again and ask for advice. He found Enki near the edge of the settlement, standing alone and watching the dry land stretch toward the horizon. Before Atrahasis could speak, Enki looked at him and said in a quiet, steady voice, "I expected you." Atrahasis stepped closer, his face thin from hunger, and asked, "Then you know why I am here. Help us." Enki lowered his gaze for a moment before answering. His voice carried both concern and restraint. Finally, he replied slowly, "This time, I cannot help you." Atrahasis stared at him in disbelief and asked, "Why?" Enki took a slow breath and answered, "What you face is drought. The rain has stopped. The soil has no water. Without water, plants cannot grow. That is why fruit dries before it ripens." Atrahasis listened carefully and then asked with quiet pain, "If you understand it, why can you not stop it?" Enki's eyes moved toward the distant command center. He knew that Enlil was watching more closely now than ever before. Enki lowered his voice and said, "Because this time you must find the answer yourself." Atrahasis stood still. For the first time since the disasters had begun, Enki was refusing to give him a solution. Atrahasis asked quietly, "You believe we can?" Enki looked at him steadily and replied, "You have already learned more than you realize." He paused before adding with calm certainty, "Think about the land. Watch it. The answer is there." Unknown to both of them, Enlil had heard the exchange through the monitoring systems in the command center. As he listened, a small smile appeared on his face. Enlil folded his arms and said quietly to himself, "So my brother has finally learned." He was certain the humans would fail. For the first time since the crisis began, Enlil believed that Enki had chosen not to interfere. Enlil watched the settlement through the projection screen and said with quiet satisfaction, "Now we will see what they truly are." Atrahasis slowly returned to the village. For many days he said little to the others. Instead, he walked across the land and observed the dry fields and the empty riverbeds. He watched where water still gathered after the rare morning mist. He noticed that even when the rivers shrank, some places in the ground still felt cooler than the rest of the soil. One evening, while walking near the edge of the dry riverbed, Atrahasis noticed something strange. A group of wild animals had gathered in one small area of the ground. They were scratching at the dirt with their hooves and paws. When the animals finally moved away, Atrahasis stepped closer to see what had drawn them there. He knelt down and touched the soil. The surface was dry, but just beneath it, the earth felt slightly damp. Curious, Atrahasis picked up a small digging tool and began clearing away the loose dirt. As he dug deeper, the soil grew darker and cooler. Then his tool struck a patch of damp earth beneath the surface. He stopped and studied the ground carefully. Atrahasis knelt beside the small hole and said quietly to himself, "Water does not disappear, it hides." The thought stayed in his mind. The next morning he gathered several of the workers and spoke to them with determination. Atrahasis stood in the center of the village and said, "The sky may not give us water, but the earth still holds it." The workers looked at him with uncertainty. Atrahasis continued explaining his idea step by step. He told them to dig deeper than they had ever dug before, not for gold this time, but for water. At first, the ground was hard and dry. The workers dug through layers of dust and stone, but Atrahasis refused to stop. Day after day, they continued digging deeper into the earth. Finally, several meters below the surface, one of the workers struck wet soil. Soon after, water slowly began to collect at the bottom of the pit. The workers stared in disbelief. Atrahasis knelt beside the new well and said with quiet relief, "The earth remembers the rain." The work did not end there. Atrahasis instructed the workers to line the walls of the well with stone so the earth would not collapse back into the hole. Clay jars were prepared to carry the water back to the village. The people also learned to let the water settle in the jars before drinking it. Sand and cloth were used to filter the dirt from the water before it was boiled over the fire. With fresh water now available, Atrahasis turned his attention back to the fields. Atrahasis spent many days watching the land around the new wells. Most of the fields were still dry and nothing grew there anymore. But near the wells, something was different. Small patches of green grass had begun to appear in the damp soil where water often spilled from the clay jars. The plants there were stronger than anything growing in the dry fields. Atrahasis knelt and touched the moist ground. The soil felt soft and cool compared to the hard earth beyond the wells. Atrahasis studied the small plants carefully and said quietly to himself, "The land still lives where the water stays." At that moment, the idea became clear to him. Atrahasis gathered the people again and explained his plan. He told the people to plant grain close to the wells. Wheat and barley were chosen because they could grow in dry land when carefully watered. The soil was broken and turned by hand so that the roots could reach deeper into the ground. Each day, water was carried from the wells and poured at the base of the plants. At first, the work felt endless, but slowly, the results began to appear. After several weeks, small green shoots rose from the soil near the wells. They were thin and fragile, barely visible above the earth. Yet with careful watering, the plants continued to grow. Soon the fields near the wells were covered with green. Atrahasis watched the people gather the first grain from the new fields. At first, they tried to eat the grains as they were, but the hard seeds were difficult to chew. One evening, while preparing food near the fire, Atrahasis noticed a woman trying to break the grains between two small stones. The seeds cracked and turned into a rough powder. Atrahasis knelt beside her and studied the crushed grain. He rubbed the powder between his fingers and realized it could be shaped with water. Atrahasis mixed the crushed grain with a little water and placed the soft paste on a flat stone near the fire. After a short time, the heat hardened it. Atrahasis lifted the warm piece and said with quiet satisfaction, "The grain can feed many if we change it." The people cut the first harvest carefully and carried it back to their homes. The grain was crushed between stones and turned into flour. Bread baked over open fires once again filled the air with its smell. From the command center, Enlil watched everything. He said quietly to himself, "They solved it." What Enlil had meant to be a punishment had become something else. The humans had not only survived the drought, but also had adapted. And that was exactly what frightened Enlil the most, because everything Atrahasis had done was proof of the very thing Enlil feared. And with that thought, Enlil began forming a third plan, one far more extreme than the last. This time, he wanted something much worse. He did not take away the water. Instead, he attacked the food itself. Without warning, the crops stopped growing. The wheat no longer formed heads. The barley dried before it could ripen. Fruit trees stood full of leaves, but there was no fruit. Even when the people carried buckets of water from the rivers and carefully poured it onto their fields, nothing changed. The soil looked normal, there was water, and yet nothing grew. The people were confused and afraid. "How can this be? We have water now. Why are we still hungry?" they asked. What they did not know was that Enlil had interfered with the seeds themselves. He had changed something deep inside the plants, something invisible to the human eye. The seeds could sprout, but they could not produce food. It was like a curse written into their very structure. The fields looked alive, but they were empty. Hunger returned, even worse than before. Enki understood immediately that this was not a natural disaster. And he knew the people would not survive long if something did not change. He expected Atrahasis to come looking for him again, but this time it did not happen. Atrahasis had already asked for help before. Now he understood that if the people were going to survive, they would have to learn to think for themselves. So instead of going to the command center, Atrahasis began watching the land around the settlements. Day after day, he observed the animals that still lived on the land. That was when he noticed something strange. The animals were not starving. Deer still moved through the tall grass. Wild goats climbed the rocky slopes. Even large herd animals passed through the valleys in groups. He often asked himself how the animals still found food. Then one day, he saw something that gave him the answer. From a distance, Atrahasis watched as a large predator chased a smaller animal across the open land. The smaller creature tried to escape, but the stronger one caught it. Soon after, the predator began to feed. But there was another problem. The animals were strong and fast. A single man could not bring one down. For several days, Atrahasis continued watching the herds move across the land. He noticed that when danger approached, the animals ran together as a group. But he also noticed that when several predators attacked from different sides, even the strongest animal could fall. Slowly, the idea began to form in his mind. Atrahasis returned to the village and gathered a small group of trusted workers. He spoke quietly to them and said, "The fields no longer feed us, but the land still holds life." The workers listened carefully as he continued. Atrahasis pointed toward the hills and said, "The animals survive because they move in groups. To catch them, we must do the same." The idea was new to many of them. They had always depended on plants. Hunting large animals was dangerous and unfamiliar, but hunger left them little choice. During the day, they continued working in the mines, just as Enlil demanded. Nothing could change there without raising suspicion. But at night, Atrahasis began preparing. After long hours underground, he stayed awake, shaping stone into sharp points. He carved strong wooden shafts and fastened the stone tips to the ends, creating simple spears. Night after night, he worked quietly beside the fire. Soon, he placed the finished weapons into the hands of the small group he trusted. Atrahasis showed them how to move together. He explained how some would circle behind the herd while others moved from the front. He taught them patience. The first hunts were difficult and frightening. Several times the animals escaped. Once a hunter was thrown to the ground by a charging goat, but Atrahasis refused to give up. He gathered the group again and spoke with calm determination. Atrahasis said, "We learn from every failure." Slowly, their skill improved. One morning, after many attempts, the group finally brought down a large animal. The hunters stood around it in silence for a moment. They had never done this before, but meat gave them the energy that the failing crops no longer could. Soon, the hunters began bringing back more animals. The people no longer depended only on the fields. The humans had found a new way to survive. Their ability to adapt frightened Enlil more than ever before. From the command center, Enlil watched the reports coming in from the settlements. The people were no longer starving. Fires burned across the villages as hunters returned with animals. The workers still arrived at the mines each morning. The disasters had not broken them. Instead, they had forced them to learn. That realization filled Enlil with a deep and growing anger. Everything he had done to restore order had only pushed the humans to become stronger and more capable. Each new hardship had turned into another lesson for them. Enlil stood alone in the chamber, staring at the projection of the human settlement spreading across the planet. He no longer saw workers. He saw a force that might one day grow beyond control. In his mind, the question was no longer whether humans should be reduced. The only question was how far he would have to go to restore the order he believed was necessary. The anger inside him grew so strong that Enlil began to consider measures even he had never imagined before. The only thing that mattered to him now was the law he believed protected Nibiru. If destroying them all would restore order, he was prepared to do it. And next time, the measure would be greater than disease or drought. And when that moment came, even Enki would be able to do very little.